I knew repowering our 78-foot yacht would be a huge decision. Our Detroit diesel 12B71s are legendary, but they come with some serious drawbacks. After weighing all the options, I made our choice, but getting there wasn't easy. What did I need to consider when picking new engines? Let's just say lots. Let's get into it. Our Yacht Tangaroa came with a pair of Detroit diesel 12B71 engines. While they're known for their reliability and power, they come with some pretty major downsides as well. For starters, fuel efficiency. They're not great. These are the very early versions, and they're pretty tragic for the kind of cruising that we want to do, so it was something that was going to have to get addressed. Secondly, these have been neglected for years and years. There were leaks everywhere, they were rusty everywhere. It would have taken a lot of maintenance work to get these back where we needed to get them to. At the end of the day, by the time we tore these things all the way down, which is what we would have had to do to fix all the leaks, to get rid of all the rust, and at that point we're rebuilding anyway, that would have been insanely expensive, and it would have taken a monstrous amount of labor. These engines are not super simple when it comes to how many things you got to take apart, so it just wasn't worth it. So we decided it was time for a repower. Now, one of the most important things that I had to consider was our power requirement. I think this is the most important, to be honest, and it's also one of the biggest things that people get wrong when they're doing repowers. You hear a lot of things about, oh, the boat never performed after I did the repower, or the engine didn't last after I did the repower. This is why. These calculations are super important. There's a couple of ways you can go about it. For one, if you already have engines in the boat, like we did, we could go off of our original fuel burn numbers. You can find graphs online that show the fuel burn graph of the engine through an RPM range, and you can then calculate by your fuel burn how much horsepower you're using. I didn't do this. I had a lot of people, because you go to forums when you're first starting to look into these things, and you kind of get some ideas and some advice from people. And the most common thing that I was running into was, oh, you need a bigger engine. You need at least 12 liters to do that boat. Oh, you need at least 14 liters. You need at least something as big as what you had. That's not the case. The problem with that, and it's actually the problem that we ran into with our Detroits, is you end up running the engine because you're so far overpowered in an area of its range that is completely inefficient. Diesel engines like to get loaded up, especially turbo diesel stuff. You want to be in the range where the turbos are working. It makes everything more efficient. And if you go too big with an engine, it's just as bad as going too small. You're running into efficiency problems. The engine is not going to be happy. So I wanted to make sure we got this right. One of the biggest examples that I can find for this is the FPB. So there were a couple that traveled the world. They did so for years, and they decided that they were going to start designing boats based around world cruising. And after many different boats that they did, they decided to come up with a powerboat version. So the FPB was born. These boats were unreal. If I had unlimited funds, I would own one, because it's definitely my dream boat. And what they are is they're a displacement hull, aluminum boats, very, very heavy duty construction. And when I say heavy duty construction, we're talking for a 78-foot boat, they're 112,000 pounds, and that's out of aluminum. In comparison, we're a 78-foot boat, we're 80,000 pounds. So that'll give you an idea of how beefy these are. I mean, we're talking half-inch hull plating, everything oversized. They're tanks. So these boats are made to go everywhere. They're made to cross in oceans. They're made to go through conditions that would be terrifying in many other boats. And for me, that's a pretty good reference to go to for engine sizing. Now, you may not believe it, but that boat is powered by a pair of John Deere 6068 AFM engines. Those are 6.8 liter, 230 horsepower, electronic common rail injected engines. And they work beautifully. While the FPB isn't an apples to apples, it's pretty close. The hull is slightly different than what we have here on Tangaroa, but she performs more like a displacement hull, is what we found anyway. So looking at the FPB, looking at what they had for engines, that's a pretty good reference. Now, I had a good real-time reference, but I needed to do more. There's a really good website out there, was a really good website out there called boatdiesel.com. It had everything you could possibly imagine. It had manuals for diesel engines, it had spec sheets, performance curves, forums to ask people questions. Phenomenal site. Another big thing that they had were calculators. So they had things that you could use to calculate how much horsepower you needed for your boat. Albeit they're going to be rough calculations, but it'll get you in the ballpark anyway. You can do this other ways. You can go and do these calculations all yourself. They're out there on the internet. You can find them. I cheated. I wasn't interested in doing that much math. I don't like maths all that much, so I did not. What I ended up finding was kind of backed up my calculations with our fuel burn is at 9 knots, we were using 60 horsepower per engine. So total of 120 horsepower, but 60 horsepower per engine. And at our hull speed of 13 knots, we were using roughly about, and this is going off memory because unfortunately I can't check anymore because boatdiesel.com has gone offline and doesn't appear to be coming back. But anyway, 240 horsepower total to reach our hull speed of 13 knots. Some of you may be shocked about that. Such a big boat, how could it possibly be so low? That's just how displacement hulls work. They don't require a lot of power until you start reaching hull speed. So now I have my power levels and I know where to go from there. Now, as you can see, based on those calculations, our Detroits were way overpowered. They were 400 horsepower per engine. Even with a safety range, I mean, that's 800 horsepower worth of engine for a boat that requires 240 to reach our hull speed. I mean, I get the whole having extra in case of an emergency. That's ridiculous. That's way too much engine. Now, I keep mentioning displacement hull, and that's where a little bit of the confusion kind of comes, I find, is some people have experience with other things. So you've got sport fish boats, for example. They're out there going fast, planing out to fishing sites, whatever they're doing, having fun, going fast. That is a completely different hull shape and requires a totally different profile of power. Here's a little graph here you can look, and it shows basically the big hump that you have to cross when you're getting a planing hull out of the water. And then it shows that the faster you go, the more power you're going to use. The other graph you see there is a displacement hull. You can see how much lower it is, and as you reach hull speed, you can see exactly what happens. Power level requirements shoot through the roof. So this is where people get mistaken. They think just because the boat's big, they need this big power level, but it's not. The two completely different animals. Now, engine manufacturers use duty ratings to tell you what kind of life expectancy you can get out of a specific engine, roughly, basically. And these ratings go right from pleasure use all the way up to continuous use and everywhere in between. Basically, what it all boils down to is an engine that would be configured, and you can have the same engine. You could have, say, for example, a QSB 6.7. It will have a continuous rating motor, and it will have a pleasure rating motor. And a lot of times, the only difference between those two motors is the tuning that's in them. They derate the continuous duty motors just to prevent you from using high load situations all the time. Obviously, if you've got a motor that can do 550 horsepower occasionally and do 240 horsepower continuously, if they just take that rating, they turn the tuning down where you can only get 240 horsepower out of it, you now have a 240 horsepower continuously rated engine. Obviously, we plan to travel the world. We're going everywhere that we can possibly think to go, and we needed something that was, at the very least, say a medium continuous duty rating. I think for Cummins engines, that's like 3,000 hours a year with, I can't remember the exact hour usage, but like 6 to 7 hours out of every 8 of wide open throttle use. And we wanted that rating because I want as much longevity as I can out of this engine. Even if I don't use wide open throttle, the less load that I use on it, the better it's going to be. And continuous duty rating, say 240 horsepower. As we saw, we only burn 120 at our cruise. So even on a continuous duty rating of 240 horsepower, we're using half of that. So that motor is going to have a pretty long life. So the next thing that I had to do, I knew my horsepower that I needed, and I knew my duty rating that I wanted to achieve. It was time to start looking at engine performance curves. And these are pretty critical. What this basically tells you is across the RPM range, how much horsepower you can use at each specific RPM point. Anything above the propeller line is overloading. Anything below the propeller line is underloading, which is not a problem to an extent. So now I had to plot our curve on here. And we knew that at 1600 RPM, we're using 120 horsepower per engine. So if I take a prop curve and say for this example would be a QSB, I think it's like a 250 horsepower medium continuous duty engine. You can see here's the curve here. And if we plot out that 120 horsepower at 1600 RPM, you're going to see we're above the prop curve line. That's using our existing 2-to-1 transmissions. This is a no-go. That's one quick way to have a very short lifespan on an engine. A couple of ways that you can get around this. You can reduce the pitch on the propellers. So we could take our, I think they're 28-inch diameter propellers, and we could pull a bit of pitch out of them. Unfortunately, you can only feasibly pull so much pitch out of a propeller. So that leaves you with new propellers. Now, once again, propellers work on efficiency ranges, and to put the propeller into that pitch range was getting out of the propeller efficiency range, which is just not going to work either. So the next option is to do a different transmission gear ratio. So if we were to say take our 2-to-1 ratio transmissions and bump them up to a 3-to-1 transmission ratio, that moves our whole curve over by, I think, like 850 horsepower, if my calculations are right, or if my memory is correct. So if we do that same plot at 120 horsepower and 850 RPM above that, we'll see now we're below the prop curve considerably. So that's actually a pretty good option. Not only does it pull our engines below the prop curve and put them in an underloaded position, which is phenomenal, it actually uses our RPM range much better. And not only that, it now takes the torque of a smaller engine, and being we've got a 3-to-1 ratio, that torque at the shaft and the propeller is now matching our original engines, which is perfect. All right, at this point, I know I've got my horsepower rating, I've got my duty rating, and I know that the engine that I'm looking at is falling below the propeller curve and is going to be a safe option. Now I get to have a little bit of fun. I get to go look through all these beautiful engines and figure out which one's going to make the most sense for us. And it's kind of like shopping for Christmas. I also needed to consider a few other things. For starters, shaft sizing. I needed to make sure that whatever engine I was doing, whatever transmission ratio that we were using, was not going to exceed the power levels that the shafts were capable of. Snapping a shaft is never a good thing. Best case scenario, it's going to leave one engine down. Worst case scenario, it's going to sink a boat. So definitely something I had to really put some thought into and make sure that the materials that are on our shafts, as well as the diameters, were going to be sufficient. Another one is ballast. I needed to make sure that the engines that I was putting in were not going to change the ballast of the boat in such a way that it was going to negatively impact the safety of the boat in a sea. Fortunately, Tangaroa is pretty stable to begin with. Unlike a lot of modern boats, she's not super tall. Being she's aluminum, there's not a lot of weight up top, and due to the construction, most of the heavier materials are down low. So she's pretty stable as it is. There's some optional things with engines when I was looking. One of them was replaceable cylinder liners. Never a bad thing. It's a good option. 100% agree with it. A lot of that depends on how accessible an engine room is. It's a feature that you don't necessarily have to have if you have some accessibility. On Tangaroa, it's not overly difficult to have access to the engine room. We've got removable panels. So this wasn't a total must-have for me. Yeah, sure, it would make it a little bit more difficult to deal with issues in the future, but not impossible. We can work with that. Some of the things that were really important to me were the ease of working on. I mean, I'm going to be living with these things for years. I don't want a difficult engine. I want something simple. I want something where everything is accessible and easy to replace. I want something that requires a fairly small spare parts package, because even though we've got a big boat, that stuff takes up space, and I don't want to have to carry around a million things to be able to service the engine later. And honestly, for me, I wanted something electronic. I love electronic engines. I've been dealing with electronic engine management for, well over a decade now, with great results. I don't have the same fear of it that a lot of people do. It doesn't hold the same stigma for me. It gives a lot of ability for integration. There's so many cool features that you can use to make things so nice. We had a lot of recommendations on what engines to use for the boat. After this video, if any of you have made recommendations, are you still thinking they're the right ones? What are you thinking now? Is there a better option that you might be able to put in there? If it was your boat, what would you do?
If you missed our last video, should we save our 1969 Detroit diesel 12V71 engines? Go check it out now. We went deep into the pros and cons of rebuilding versus repowering, and it set the stage for everything we talked about today. Don't miss it.
It's such a pretty boat.